Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. Carl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show. Carl Block is both a corporate lawyer and a corporate restructuring partner in the Los Angeles office of Loeb & Loeb, LLP. Nothing in the podcast should be construed as legal advice. To the extent legal issues are discussed, please consult an attorney if you have any questions or need advice relating to the matters discussed. This podcast may constitute attorney advertising in certain jurisdictions. The views expressed in the podcast are not necessarily the views of Loeb & Loeb or Carl Block. Carl and each guest reserves the right to change any opinions that may be expressed on the show and disagree with what others say, even if such disagreement is not expressed during the podcast.
All right, so I would like to start talking about the U.S. a little bit now, if you don't mind. And obviously, where the U.S. economy is right now, there are some people who think everything's fine. There's a lot of people who don't. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of inflation. There's some talk of a recession. Some say there won't be one. Some say there will be. Some say it's just a matter of when. But in terms of just sort of a recap, how did we get to this point for those people who may not pay attention to this as much as you do? How did we get to the point for having this massive inflation?
Well, there's several steps, Carl. The first step is that when COVID hit, the government started spending a lot of money, and as a result, the revenues didn't keep pace with that huge surge in government expenditures, and there was a deficit, a record deficit. The biggest deficit is a percent of GDP that we've ever had, and that had to be financed, and it was financed about 90%. That's step one. Step one, government expenditures go up, government revenues don't follow, and we have a massive deficit that has to be financed. That's step one. Step two was over 90% of that deficit was financed by the Federal Reserve. It was what we call monetized. So, and how did that happen? Well, the government, the treasury, issued debt, and most of the debt that was issued, over 90% of it was bought by the Federal Reserve. Now, when that happens, the Federal Reserve is extending credit to the government, and that credit is part of the money supply. And so the money supply started exploding. And as a result of that, we had inflation. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It is the monetization of the debt that counted. The debt could have been financed, by the way, by just selling all the bonds to the public, and we wouldn't have had any inflation. We wouldn't have had any change in inflation if that would have been the case. But or they could have increased taxes to finance it, close that deficit, and we wouldn't have had inflation. We had inflation because the Fed monetized the debt and increased the money supply as a result. Now, the money supply, just for context, the money supply zoomed up and it reached a record rate year over year of about 26%. Now, to give context to this, Hanke's golden growth rate, the rate that would allow the Fed to hit its 2% inflation target, is around 6.3%. So they were increasing the money supply 3 times faster than Hanke's golden growth rate. So we got a lot of inflation. Now, inflation, when the money supply expands with a lag, and this is the key thing, with a lag of about 1 to 9 months, economic asset prices go up. And they did. Remember, the stock market boomed. And And real estate, remember real estate? Boom. And then the next thing that lags after the money supply has a significant change in it is real economic activity. And that lag is about 6 to 18 months. It takes a little longer. And what did we have? The economy started booming after that huge injection of money into the economy. And then the last thing we get is prices start to change. The consumer price index starts changing with a lag of about 12 to 24 months. So it was true to form, exactly what the monetarists like myself and Milton Friedman and John Greenwood, who I work with, who's, by the way, a fellow. John used to be the chief economist until he retired at Invesco, and now he's a fellow at the Johns Hopkins Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise. We have a lot of very distinguished people who are fellows, by the way. And another one's my good friend, Jacques de la Rosière. Jacques in Paris, John Greenwood's in London, but they're fellows at the Institute. And Jacques, former governor of the Banque de France, former managing director of the IMF, former president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So we've got a lot of heavyweights who are fellows. And that gets to your initial question. We have a group, a kind of a core group seeing the world roughly the same way, who are fellows, as well as Professor Galambos and myself. And then we've got the young undergraduates who are research assistants who are, doing a lot of grunt work, keeping the lights on, as they say. So that's how we got inflation. At Greenwood and I, by the way, were in the Wall Street Journal. If you go back, we were the only ones who actually put a number on where we were going with inflation, and we absolutely hit the bullseye. We said that it would go up to perhaps as high as 9%, and the CPI actually peaked out at 9.1%. And then we changed course. We saw the Fed wasn't looking at the money supply going up, and it wasn't looking at the money supply once it started going down. And now it's contracting at minus 3.7% year over year. That's unprecedented. It's been contracting for over a year. This hasn't happened since 1938. So now Greenwood and I see our new inflation forecast that we made, like a year ago, said we'd end this year between 2 and 5%. And I think we'll probably be close to the lower end of that. But you mentioned the word R, recession, and a recession is pretty much baked in the cake, because remember I said after you get a big change in the money supply with a lag of 6 to 18 months, you get a change in economic activity. So that change in economic activity, if the money supply is diving, the change in economic activity is what? It's diving. But it won't happen until next year. We're kind of sleepwalking into a recession. We're sleepwalking into troubled waters. So people ask, well, why did Warren Buffett unload so many stocks in the second quarter of this year? Well, I think Buffett can see that they're going to be. He sees the storm clouds on the horizon, and he's not known as a sleepwalker. He might be 93 years old, but he's not sleepwalking.
I understand. So we're doing this, it sounds like, because the Fed isn't making the money supply analysis the way monetarists will, and now we're potentially on the way to a recession next year. Is there anything that the Fed could do to ameliorate that?
Well, they could. They're doing two things. They've raised the federal funds rate at an unprecedented increase to the current level. It looks like, by the way, in the Federal Open Market Committee meeting they have this month, that they'll probably won't change them. They'll keep them the same. But they have raised those federal funds rates. But the main thing they're doing is quantitative tightening. They're shrinking the balance sheet, and when they do that quantitative tightening, that directly squeezes the money supply and contracts the money supply. So at step one, they should stop the quantitative tightening, and step two, of course, they shouldn't be changing the Fed funds rate, or maybe even lowering the Fed funds rate, because that works indirectly into the system, because the biggest contributor to the money supply really isn't the Fed, it's the commercial banks. Commercial bank deposits make up around 83% of the money supply measured by him too. And right now, on a year-over-year basis, bank credit is actually contracting by minus 0.4%. So they're not, banks aren't contributing anything to the money supply. They're actually shrinking it a little bit. And the Fed, of course, is shrinking because of quantitative tightening. So I would say the best thing would be to try to get that money supply up to Hanke's golden growth rate of around 5-6%, something like that. So they should stop doing what they're doing, but they're not going to do that, because Chairman Powell has said on the record many times that the Fed doesn't believe in the quantity theory of money. Just one thing, let me quote just a couple things what he said. He says, this is Powell, we now understand better how little we understand about inflation. They remember, the Fed never predicted inflation. They kept saying, oh, this is a temporary thing. We've got all these exogenous shocks going on. That's oil prices going up, war in Ukraine. Remember the supply chain thing?
Sure.
So it was a lot of ad hoc reasons for inflation, but no money supply. Never mentioned money supply. Powell said changes in monetary aggregates have not had a consistent, reliable relationship. They haven't been a good predictor of the economy or inflation. Well, this is nonsense. I just completed a study that'll be published in World Economics within a few days, actually. I looked at 147 countries, Carl, from 1991 until 2022, and I looked at the average rate of growth in the money supply broadly measured in those 147 countries, and the inflation rate. And the correlation was plus 0.94.
Wow.
It was almost 1-to-1. And by the way, Milton Friedman said that's exactly what we should expect. We should expect a 1-to-1 relation. Gottfried Haberler, a great Austrian economist, by the way, said he's never witnessed a sustained inflation in any country in the world over 4% unless there had been a large increase in the money supply prior to the measurement of inflation. So anyone looking at inflation and not looking at the money supply is completely flying blind, and that's what the Fed is doing. I mean, they've doubled down on this, by the way. Paul has gone on the record over and over stating that inflation is caused by all these ad hoc things and not the money supply.
So, I mean, with respect to Chairman Powell, every time in our country that we've had inflation, it's always been because of ad hoc, extraneous events. It's never been because of the money supply. It's never been because of, too much credit being available, people taking too much risk at a time. None of that matters in terms of using money. It's all extraneous events.
That's the excuse, but this is a standard central banking thing, Carl. If you study central banks, they don't want the noose of inflation to go around their neck. They want to say it's somebody else, something else caused all this. And the reason why is that the public hates inflation.
Yes, of course. And I think, as you know very well, when inflation does start coming down, that doesn't mean that the prices are all of a sudden dropping from where they were. It just means they're growing less. And people, so we've got an elevated level of prices. That's not going to go, those prices aren't going to go down just because inflation goes down from 5% to 4% to 3% or what have you, until there's another kind of economic event, right?
Right, exactly. Now let's talk about the ad hoc thing and just a little bit more so people get an idea of what's happening. So we're talking today. I have to look at the calendar. It is September 7th for the record. Yesterday, the headline in the Financial Times was the oil prices have surged over $90 per barrel, and that is going to give us inflation. No, this is all wrong. This means the relative price of oil has gone up relative to everything else, but it says nothing about inflation, because inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's due to the money supply. Now, let me give you a classic example to illustrate this. In the 1970s, we had two oil crises. One was in 1973. Oil prices shot up. OPEC, you remember, put the clobber on things, and oil prices shot up in 1973. So if we look at Japan, what did Japan do? Well, the Bank of Japan said, well, gee, the oil prices are going up. We have to accommodate that increase by increasing the money supply. They did, and they got inflation. And of course, everybody said, oh, oil prices went up and that caused inflation in Japan. Then the second oil crisis hit in 1979, and oil prices again went up. But the Bank of Japan said, we're not going to play the game this time. We're not going to increase the money supply to go along with those oil price increases. And lo and behold, oil prices in 1979 went up. The relative price of oil went up compared to everything else, but the price level didn't go up. And it didn't go up because the money supply didn't go up in Japan. So that's how it works. But there's constant confusion and noise in the system because the propaganda put out by the central banks always, once inflation rears its ugly head, the central banks will be giving a million reasons for why this is happening. None of them have anything to do with the central bank and the surge in the money supply that's preceded the price increases.
I understood. I mean, if you didn't increase the money supply and oil was $90 a gallon or went up, at some point, if the money supply isn't greater and therefore there's going to be less ability to buy oil, you might actually have the opposite effect of inflation, wouldn't you?
Oh, you could. You very well could have oil prices going up or commodity prices in general, and have a deflation with prices going down. If the money supply was growing at a very slow rate or contracting, that would be the case.
So, I mean, as you say, you have empirical, evidence that you're right about that. I want to talk about a couple of other things because we hear, to your point, that the central banks seem to have their own view of things. And I've read a lot about how they're very closely tied to the Phillips curve. So how do we measure what's going on in the economy? It's the employment rate. How did they come up with that? And is it one of these things where a broken clock is right twice a day? Or how did they decide to be so heavily weighted on the Phillips curve?
Well, the Phillips curve has been around for quite some time, and when it was originally posed, the Phillips curve, by the way, if people have a piece of paper and put a quadrant down, and they put unemployment on one axis and inflation on the other, it's a negative slope. So if you want to reduce unemployment, you increase inflation. If you decrease inflation, unemployment goes up. So that's the negative relationship. So at one period of time in the United States, it actually looked like that there was something kind of to that idea and empirically. And of course, Phillips, when he produced his article, he presented evidence showing that was the relationship, a negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. In fact, the model itself is misspecified, what we call misspecified, and economists have gotten on it just because it's a simple idea, and for a little period of time it looked like it actually worked, but in fact the model is misspecified, and if you plot unemployment and inflation, the curve is positive with unemployment lagging changes in inflation by 1 to 2 years. So if you specify the model right and look at the relationship between unemployment and inflation, the curve, the Phillips curve, it isn't negative, it's positive. And you have to do that, of course, with the lag of unemployment is more or less 1 to 2 years, something like that, and you get a positive curve. So it's just this happens all the time in economics, using the wrong model. Now, what kind of model, macroeconomic model, do they use at the Fed? And what do they teach for the last 30 years at universities? That are new Keynesian economics, and those new Keynesian models, they don't have a money aggregate in the model. Money is not in the model. So you ask, well, why is the Fed ignoring money? Well, it's not in the model. Now you also have a political aspect of the thing, and that is in the Federal Reserve System, there's 785 economists, more or less. And the ratio of Democrats to Republicans is 48.5 to 1. There are almost 50 Democrats for every Republican on the in economic staff. Now you say, well, what's that have to do with anything? Well, it has a lot, because one of the big burrs in the saddle of any Democrat in economic policy anyway is Milton Friedman. The late Milton Friedman, my former mentor, dean of monetarism, and dean of looking at monetary aggregates as being the guide for the determination of where national income is going. That means GDP, inflation, where are they going in the economy? So I think there is a very heavy political bias that's in there too. They have the wrong models, the new Keynesian models with no monetary aggregates, and their nemesis, all Democrats, Milton Friedman, they will poo-poo Milton Friedman from morning until night. So that's it. Now, where does that lead? It leads to a fairly simple thing. It's not what young economists are taught. That's why the Fed was never able to, if they know so much, and they've got a bunch of bright boys and gals down there, why couldn't they forecast inflation going up? And why can't they forecast it going down? They've missed the boat completely. Their forecasts are rubbish. I mean, as far as I know, on inflation, maybe there are others out there, but in writing, in the Wall Street Journal, John Greenwood and I are the only two that have the inflation story right. And the reason for that, we were using a strict monetarist model, the equation of exchange, the identity, MV, money times velocity, equals PY, the price level times Y, the real growth in the economy.
Understood. So we sadly can't change the Fed right now. but you still are a successful predictor of things. Others may not agree with the Fed, but they have other ideas. As you know, there's Wall Street loves the yield curve analysis. Why are they so wedded to the yield curve analysis as opposed to M2 or
Well, I
other?
would say the yield curve analysis, I would characterize it this way: some on Wall Street, not all. Some do look at the yield curve, and when the yield curve is a complement of the money supply. The money supply is the first thing you want to look at. That is the foundation for everything going on. It's a measure of broad money. But one key price is the yield curve. That's the short-term rates over the long-term rates. And when that becomes negative, when the short-term rates become much higher than the long-term rates, we can go back about 150 or 60 years, and there's never been a recession that hasn't been preceded by a negative yield curve. So that has a perfect record of predicting. So that's why some people, by the way, look at the yield curve, and that's why some people are always right, because the yield curve's always right.
And what are the potential flaws or weaknesses of just straight yield curve analysis?
I think that I wouldn't say they're flaws, but if you really want to get to the foundation of what's going on, you've got to look at and understand what is happening to the money supply and why it's happening. And to do that, you've got to look at the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve, because that produces monetary liabilities. And the big elephant in the room are commercial banks. You've got to look at balance sheets. And you start at the liabilities on both those balance sheets. That gives you the money supply. But the key thing is you've got to do what we call a credit counterparts analysis, and that is you've got to go over to the asset side of the balance sheet of the Fed as well as the commercial banks to see how the composition of the assets is changing, because that will tell you actually why the liability side is changing. In other words, it's one thing to get a number, Carl, for the money supply, M2. It's quite another thing to understand why is M2 changing. And the only way you can figure that out is by going not to the liability side of the central bank and the commercial banks, but you have to go to the asset side. Now, as it turns out, by the way, most economists don't know how to do this. They don't know how to read balance sheets. So that's another problem.
Well, if they don't believe in M2 or money zero management or what have you, it's irrelevant to them. I mean,
well, it is irrelevant because they don't even look at the liability side. So why should they look at the asset side?
I get it.
So at any rate, that's kind of where we're at. There are only really a handful of people that I know who understand and know how to do this in a skillful way. It's a little bit tricky, by the way. It's not your freshman course in economics kind of thing. You're not going to learn. Number one, you're not going to learn any of this in most economics courses. My students do learn it, by the way, but
wow.
Most places they have no idea what they're doing.
Okay, so quickly with respect to Wall Street question, there's some discussion about wanting to decouple long-term treasury rates from the federal funds rate, or the borrowing rates. How do you feel about that? And so that instead of, and I mean, I'm sure the reason why people are talking about this on Wall Street is because once the long-term treasuries keep going up, the cost to borrow money goes up.
Right, the cost to borrow money goes up, and the key thing is that the cost of financing the U.S. government goes up because remember the interest cost on financing the U.S. government has in fact gone up tremendously since the long-term interest rates. Well, since interest rates in general have gone up, not only long-term but short-term. So these interest payments that are being made to finance the federal budget, they eat up a lot of the budget. The taxpayers are just paying interest for nothing. They're getting nothing for it.
Understood.
So this is surging, and I can't put my finger on exactly the increase, what it's at now, Carl. Unfortunately, I don't have it at my fingertips, but it's very considerable.
Understood. So let me then ask you.
Well, by the way, back to your thing about controlling the long-term rates. That's called yield curve control. The yield curve control is something they've tried in Japan. It's an utter disaster. We had a little period of time in the United States where they tried to do that too, and it didn't work. It never works. But the yield curve control in Japan is given Japan about 30 years of zombie economy, because the money supply in Japan has grown at a very slow rate since about 1990, with this yield curve control kind of thing in place. And the economy has grown very slowly, and they've always suffered with essentially no price increases until very recently. So the yield curve control idea is inherently a bad idea. If you want any control idea, you've got to go to Hanke's golden growth rate and get in there. What is the rate of increase in broad money that's consistent with hitting an inflation target? And in the United States, 2% is the inflation target. If you plug all the numbers in and fool around with the thing a little bit, you come up with about 6% is the golden growth rate.
Understood. So, and then turning sort of to the analysis of how we get out of this. First, let me ask you, if you could tell the average person, what are the three things you need to have a sustainable, healthy economy? What would you tell them?
Well, I'd say go back to 1980 and President Reagan's transition report. Road to economic growth, and what were the elements there? Stable money, that means a golden growth rate, a monetarism with a golden growth rate of about 6%. That's going to give you stability, and stability might not be everything, but everything is nothing without stability.
Sure.
And a hefty dose of deregulation and free trade, deregulation and free trade, and a control of the budget and government spending. We need a constitutional amendment that would be something like the constitutional change that they made a few years ago in Switzerland, where they put in a Swiss debt brake. You can't increase the rate of growth in the government any more rapidly than the rate of growth in the economy. In short, the government can't grow relative to the rest of the economy. So those would be the three things. Hanke's golden growth rate, a monetarist rule over at the Fed, a good healthy dose of deregulation, free trade, and I would add flat taxes. Get a simplified flat tax system. Throw that in. So the deregulation thing has really three parts of that. That would be deregulation, more free trade, and a simple flat tax system, and then the last thing would be the Swiss debt brake that constrained the rate of growth in the government.
Understood. Turning to where we are now, where we're spending $7 trillion a year and we have these record deficits. Yeah, you've said, well, okay, there's kind of no free lunches. how do you get rid of that? You either have to have your economy grow so much and the tax revenue increase so much that you can pay down some of this debt, or you may have to increase taxes because you can't just keep borrowing money to refinance debt and not eventually have to pay the debt. When people talk about raising taxes, it becomes very abstract. Who, do you think there's a sentiment when people say, well, we'll just raise taxes to deal with this, that it's all going to be on the top 1% of people or the top 0.1 of the 1%? Or do they understand how much these taxes are going to have to be imposed on the middle class as well?
Well, the tax, by the way, speaking of inflation, the inflation tax really falls on the poor.
Sure.
Relative to the rich. The rich, remember, the rich, if you start goosing the money supply, the first thing that goes up are asset prices with a lag of about 1 to 9 months. So who owns assets? Well, rich people do. Rich people made out like bandits. We had in the last 5 years, the billionaires in the United States, their chunk or their wealth has gone up from 15% of GDP to 18% of GDP.
Wow.
So the last 5 years, where we've witnessed all this inflation, COVID subsidies, and all the rest of it, where's that money gone? It's gone to the rich. It hasn't gone to the poor. The rich are taking a bigger chunk, not a smaller chunk of GDP. So big government is for rich people. This is a great myth. Let's go through the things that I said Reagan was for. Then we had this 3 things. We had deregulation. No, we're getting more regulation. Flat taxes. No, we're not getting flat, simplified taxes. We're getting more progressive and complicated taxes. Deregulation, free trade, I should say. Free trade. We have more protectionism. Look at all these sanctions being put on everybody, weaponizing the dollar, all of this stuff. This is all protectionist, interventionism, protectionism. And then the growth in government, of course, and deficits. The Swiss debt break isn't there. They're spending like drunken sailors down there. But Biden just wants to put in a supplemental spending bill that I think will take the debt. The deficit could surge again to maybe 9% of GDP.
Understood.
Which is, by the way, about double what the bipartisan Congressional Budget Office is predicting. I think it's going to be much higher. And this is because of the following reasons. One is that the interest payments on the debt are increasing substantially. 2, we are pouring huge amounts of money into Ukraine. We're fighting a war and financing it. Yesterday, Secretary of State Blinken was just in Kiev and handed another $1 billion over to the Ukrainians. It's just $1 billion here, $1 billion there. I mean,
no, I understood. Let me present.
As Senator Dirksen once said, $1 billion here, $1 billion here. Pretty soon it adds up to real money.
Understood. Thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.